Hey guys, welcome back. Reese and Ben here pursuing the arts. And today in the video, you're going to be seeing a lecture by Dr. Tobias Capwell that took place at Arnie Coates Harness Fitness Symposium. So last year, during the symposium, Capwell came out and gave us a lecture on armor. So back then, I told you it was coming soon. So unfortunately, close to a year now, it's coming out. But there was a reason why that was.
Yeah, with all the images, the photos that he used in his lecture, they're all property of individual museum, specifically individual museums, and we required that we get permission to use those to put them on display publicly. And there was a lot of red tape to go through, a lot of mail, email, a lot of messages back and forth to make sure that everything was all in line so that we could use them without getting him or us in trouble.
Yeah, so copyright infringement. Yay. So, all right, guys. So, enough talking. So, we'll let you guys enjoy the lecture now.
So, Art asked me to speak at this event, and I for a long time I wasn't really sure what to talk about, because this is one of the fun things about this subject is that there's endless different ways you can approach it, and being very creative about the way you approach the evidence and what you find in it. And I've never been to a symposium like this before, really, so I thought I knew something about my audience, and I went with what I thought was right, so we'll see. I wanted to talk a little bit about what I've been exploring academically over the last 20 years or so, but of course I also want to talk about how we explore things practically, and how we learn things by doing it. Most academics don't do it practically, and a lot of practical people probably don't do as much homework as they should. And I've always found that trying to keep one foot in the world of the practitioner and one foot in the world of academic work, that the two have, not surprisingly, a tremendous amount to offer each other. When you are a practitioner, questions come up that would never occur to you in the library. And similarly, as a practitioner, you have access to potential ways of finding answers or suggesting possible answers that would never come up through traditional academic means. But at the same time, the real deep historical inquiry value of what we do as practitioners has to be backed up by homework in the library. If you are doing something that is wildly different than the experience of our historical ancestors, then it's fun for us, but it has no historical validity. The value of what you find out is determined by how good your reconstruction is. The better the reconstruction, the more valuable the results. So I want to talk a little bit about that and how I've been trying to balance those two things myself, and learn what that has to do a bit more with armor and people who want to fight in it. If I can use this part. There we go. So I'm gonna start about 20 years ago. I started doing practical stuff longer ago than that, but 20 years ago is a good place to start, with just as an illustration of how far we've come with our basic understanding of armor. You know, someone who's young and comes into it now at this level that we are all at today, they're coming in as beginners at a much higher level. You know, there's like 20 or 30 years of modern work behind and supporting people coming into it now. And it's worth taking an inventory of where we were a while ago, because I think it's very illustrative. Sometimes it's useful to take stock of how far we've come. It's easy to forget what it was like 10 or 15 or 20 years ago. And 10 or 15 or 20 years ago, certainly in academic armor circles, but in a lot of practitioners, for a lot of practitioners as well, this was a very common comparison to make. it was like 15th century armor 101. There was the German style, and there was the Italian style. And the Italian style was all smooth and plain and boring looking. And the German style was all sleek and fantastic and fluty and spiky and pierced and decorated and amazing looking.
Yeah.
But this isn't really a fair comparison. A, because this is a generation earlier than that, and a generation, 10 years, 5 years in the story of the development of armor is a long time. A lot can happen in a decade, let alone a generation. And this is also an armor made by one of the greatest armorers who ever lived, for one of the richest and most powerful people who ever lived. This is probably a little more typical. This is in quality terms, purely on the status and cost involved, this is lower on the pecking order than that. And there's all kinds of reasons why this is an unreasonable comparison. But this was a comparison that was often made. And people didn't understand really why these armors were different. Even if you ignore the decoration and everything. Why is a German armor different than an Italian armor? People didn't see that there was any functional difference, at least in where I was in Western museums. This was all down, we understood that these were both war armors. So on a functional level, on a practical level, everybody kind of assumed that it's the same gear. It just looks different cosmetically, because the Italians have a different idea about what looks good, and the Germans like fluting. But otherwise, it's the same thing. It's like the idea that the only difference in these two cars is their color. But functionally, they are identical. And there are you go back on YouTube, right? And you look for some older, armor documentaries or fighting documentaries, probably some I'm in. Hopefully I didn't say it, but somebody says it in the program, that, whether you wore German armor or Italian armor was a matter of personal preference. Like, pick your color, right? And, when I was jousting at the Royal Armories in the mid to late 90s, we all wore German armors because our very small jousting community, one of the seeds of what has become a much bigger community, was the second generation from an English group called the Medieval Society, which were a small kind of living history sort of group in the 1960s and 70s, and they liked German armor, they just thought it looked neat, so they had it. And we wore what they wore because you do what you're brought up with. You learn from what you're brought up with. And we all wore German armor because that's what we wore. And but then some of us, as a few more people started to get into it, one or two said, well, I don't want to wear German armor. I want to wear an Italian armor. So they go off and get an Italian armor. We go, ooh, this is an Italian armor. This is different than what we've seen before. And as our jousting culture in the late 90s developed into the early 2000s, you start to see a couple of Italian armors sneaking in. But we all still thought, but it's the same gear, really. It just doesn't have fluting, right? And we had looked at the pictures in the books, but we hadn't at that point really understood all of the factors that make one armor different from another. And one thing nobody had ever considered, because we were all 22, 23 years old and it didn't really make any difference, was the weight. When you start looking at weights, there's a whole lot of variation. And it's not just that one has fluting and one doesn't. There are some types of apparently generic war armor that are radically of different weights than others. We didn't understand weights at all. And in fact, I'm kind of ashamed to say that it's taken me a really long time to understand just how important the weights, the precise weights of individual pieces are. And in my own work, there's been various motivating factors that I've stumbled on across the way that have made me think more about weight. And just how important a factor it is, the total weight that you are wearing. And how does it vary, and what are the effects of the variance? And normally it seems, this is a slide I worked up when I was doing some Agincourt related material, and I wanted to be able to show, you know, that in the early 15th century, the armor can look outwardly identical. But depending on how you wear it, whether it's a full mail shirt underneath or not, depending on the thickness of your breastplate, which is not cosmetically obvious, you know, the armor that looks like that can be 20 kilos or it can be 35 kilos. And that's a big difference in human terms. And I started to think, you know, that the precise weights of different kinds of field armor might be really, really important. And it doesn't, I mean, none of the relationship between what an armor looks like and how it works, what the human experience of wearing it is, becomes much more of an issue as large pieces of plate armor become increasingly common. And you have to make choices. How many plates of what kind, of what thickness, becomes a big issue later in the 14th century and into the 15th century. Before that, you know, the weight is still an issue, but there aren't the same kind of crucial considerations between the different properties determining how the armor works. The most important of which, for any armor, whether you're an ancient Greek hoplite or a Challenger tank driver, is the inverse proportional relationship between mobility and protection. I mean, you know, everyone has kind of found this out for themselves in their own practical experience, but, you know, as mobility goes up, protection goes down. And as protection goes up, mobility goes down. And you cannot have the best of both. Absolutely not. You can't raise both of those because it's always like this. And you have to make choices. You want more mobility, the plates are lighter, there's more funny articulation everywhere, and your protection's going down. And if you want the protection going up, the plates get thicker, they get bigger, your mobility goes down. And I think in the 15th century, you really start to see an increasingly specific awareness that your equipment has to be more specifically designed to the particular job you expect to be doing on the battlefield. And that's always true to an extent throughout history. But the development of large pieces of plate armor really starts to put pressure on this in very specific ways. This is a nice, I love this example because the transition from bassinets with aventails, which had been good for everybody for a long time, and then in a few short years, a lot more people have to wear these. Or now, you have to make a choice. Are you going to wear one of these or one of those? Because these give you much better protection in an age when now you might get hit in the throat by a guy with a lance rest, and he can hit you 4 times harder than he could 20 years ago. So this just, for cavalry, heavily armored knightly cavalry, this just isn't good enough anymore. And you've got to have these. But this represents a choice. You are taking a substantial cut in your mobility in favor of protection. It's a specific choice under specific functional pressures. And the same with body armor. You know, throughout the 13th and 14th centuries, most body armor is basically a variation on this idea. And there's not a lot of variation really in the protection to mobility ratio. But as soon as you introduce these, again, it's a choice you have to make. This is going to degrade your range of movement in a new way. Not to say you can't move in these. It's about the precise balance. And how thick is this? How much more weight are you carrying? Is the price you are paying in getting tired and being more restricted worth paying? The answer, often, when there's Englishmen shooting 140,000 arrows at you in 10 minutes, might be yes, it is worth paying, thank you very much. But the point is that increasingly in the 15th century, fighting men have to make more specific choices. And also, the same individual people might have to increasingly fight in different ways. By the 15th century, you can see that starting to happen. I mean, in my work on English armor, you know, the effigies in England are so good when you start putting them together. You can see these very clear developments in the first half of the 15th century. They are increasingly building up the amount of plate armor on their bodies. And I mean, they're already very well protected, but the introduction of key areas, everything, the plate is marching across the body in a very specific way. And when I was looking at effigies for my PhD, of course, that tells you what the stuff looks like, but the stone figures don't tell you why is it built like that. You know, this is what it is, no question about it, but why? How does this stuff work? Why is this different than what I'm seeing elsewhere? So, again, as someone who's trying to be an academic and a practitioner at the same time, I've got to hazard my body in the pursuit of my subject. And so I built, I mean, most people have probably seen this on the internet or whatever. I built this, who's this guy? He'll never go anywhere. This was in 2004, I think, this image. Good old Wowzer. Yeah. That was when I first met him. He was like 12. He's gone on to do a few things since. But so an important part of the PhD for me was to build one of these armors just as it is on the effigy, to learn more about what the real practical functional issues are. What does an armor built like this get you? How does it work, and why? That question why. You know, everybody wants the answer to the question why. It's the first thing. Oh, yes, English armor is different. No, do they say to me, well, Toby, how is it different? No, no, no. But why? Why? My PhD committee at one point had to say to me, Toby, stop asking the question why. Don't ask it. Don't worry about it. We want to know how. We want to know when. We want to know what. We don't care about why. Why is an endless, unsolvable problem, right? But I did want to know why. And so building an armor is one way of doing that, and building things with all those particular English idiosyncrasies, and then going out and finding, wearing it and finding out why that might be. This armor is an English style one that dates from about 1440. So it's at the period when the English style technically had established itself fully. All the key elements of the English style are in place now to be tested. If you go earlier, it hasn't quite developed yet, and you could go later as well, but this is where I went. And we'll take stock of that in a minute, but there's the long skirt, there's the fully enclosed cuisses, there's Mac. This is, the armor was made obviously by Robert McPherson. I don't know who that 12-year-old over there is.
There's the 15th century.
And then, but you know, working with armor and trying to do different things with it, I found very quickly that there were options already by the middle of the 15th century. There are so many different helmet types, so many different ways of setting the equipment up. What does this have to do with how you're fighting? In the second year I had this armor. I had the bassinet with the exchangeable visors. This was a new idea. This is one thing that everybody in the community now takes for granted. When any jouster's getting an army, oh yeah, of course I'm going to get the great bassinet with the 3 visors. Yeah, yeah. You know, well, hang on a minute. Do you know where that came from? There were some people that had that idea. You're starting to get these armors that can be adapted for multiple roles. I think it's very interesting, actually, that now that there are enough people who are wanting to do all of this very specific, different kinds of fighting in armor, they are starting to put all the same pressures on the equipment that was happening in the 15th century. I mean, they're putting certain limitations on it because we want to stay within a historical period. You can't then go to the 16th century if that's not what you want to do. But we are saying, okay, I have to fight on horseback in this, but I have to get down and fight on foot in this. And I'm fighting in this kind of tournament, but I also want to do war. And you know, we as modern practitioners are putting the same kinds of demands on the equipment and driving its technological development. I mean, it isn't actual technological development, but what it is us finding out more about what was really going on because we're asking the questions. If you're not needing solutions to these key problems, you don't inquire of the evidence. You only see what you're looking for, right? We see with our brains, not with our eyes. If you're not looking for it in the evidence, you won't see it. So I needed a better jousting helmet, but I also needed to fight in tourneys, and I noticed that a lot of these helmets have removable visors, and you can put different visors on, and you can change the way the helmet works and use it in different ways. Now, interestingly, there isn't a lot of direct evidence for this. The idea that you have a bassinet with different visors for different functions. You know, all of the bassinets that survive have one visor, right? And this one at Kerberg is fascinating because it's a great bassinet that would be fine for war, except that it has what clearly seems to be a visor for the joust on it. And then we look at contemporary sources, and we see bassinets of the same construction, basically, with different visors on it. And I think to myself as a practitioner, well, why can't I have one of these with one of those as well? You can, absolutely, and it works great most of the time. But where is the evidence that they actually did it? And sometimes, like this one, it won't work. You know, this is actually a war bassinet or a general purpose bassinet that was adapted slightly later, where at a slightly later date, maybe even only like 10 or 20 years later, they riveted this big plate on the front that really only works as, you know, a jousting configuration. And it actually stops this rear plate from moving a little bit as it should. So this is clearly a later interpolation, and now you can't use it for anything else if you build a helmet like this as it is now. So I always like to try and, as far as I can, make sure that what I'm doing has as much direct evidence as possible. So yeah, there's the male model shot that didn't get in the book eventually for obvious reasons. But you know, by this time, I had now run into a couple of problems with this armor for functional reasons. I had built this armor primarily to answer questions in my PhD. Why did the English build their armors like this? But I also wanted to use this for my practical activities. My problem was, my practical activities were almost exclusively on horseback. At this point in my life and my career, I wasn't doing much fighting on foot at all. But I discovered, after I built the armor and thought about it for a while, that these English armors are built like this because they are optimized for fighting on foot. It's not that you can't get on your horse and get the job done if you need to, but this is not what the emphasis is. They are optimizing the armor for fighting on foot. And I've got an armor that's optimized for fighting on foot, but I never fight on foot. And I'm always on a horse, and I'm sitting on the horse going, I can sort of do this, but it's really not the right gear for the job, and why am I wearing it? And actually, you'll see from the older pictures, originally, I had the longer skirt with smaller tassets, and I had the fully enclosed cuisses, and I had all this stuff that's absolutely primarily for fighting on foot. But in my second couple of years in this armor, I changed it because I've got to move this armor back to being better for fighting on horseback, because that's just all I'm doing. I found myself with the wrong gear for the job I was doing, and it never occurred to me that I should sit down and think, as a practitioner, as someone who's going to go out and depend on this stuff to keep me safe, I really need to think very carefully about what am I doing in this armor, and therefore, what is the best historical solution, or this best historical option for what I am trying to do. And so you can see I got rid of the closed cuisses. Mac changed them. He shortened the skirt, grumbling about it, and changed the tassets. This is the Mark II version of the black armor. And this was, for me, a better balance. But it was never going to be perfect, because it's really an armor that's heavily weighted in its design priorities for something else. So just to recap on this whole English thing, when you get to about 1440, don't you think it's interesting? Let's take a recap. The things that define this armor are great bassinet, symmetrical arm defenses that allow really good upward mobility in the arms and shoulders, a cuirass with a long skirt, like at least 6 plates, and sometimes as many as 8 plates long. Okay? Fully enclosed upper legs, and sabatons that do not interact with the greaves. Right? Italian and German greaves, sabatons have plates that go up inside to maintain the underlap of the sabatons over the greaves, like little articulating plates in there. The English cut the sabatons low, so there's no interaction between the greave and the sabaton, because they want that full mobility in their foot. They want their foot to be able to do anything it would do ordinarily. They don't want anything messing up the ankle. And again, for fighting on foot, that kind of makes sense. So these are all the key defining features of the English armor. Not to say you don't get some of these features elsewhere. Of course you do. Other people are wearing great bassinets. Other people have armor. A lot of this looks a lot like German armor of the same period. The Germans are doing the same kinds of things. And if someone goes and does a PhD about how German knights are fighting, maybe they find out that a lot of times they fight on foot. I don't know. That's beyond what I've done, but you know, one likes to think. But don't you think it's interesting that all these features that define the English war armor of the 1430s and 40s are found on an armor like this? This is a tournament armor for formal courtly combat on foot in the champ close, an armor just designed for one-on-one fighting in a sport courtly context, and all of its weird, specific features are the same. Freely acting sabatons, built in a slightly different way, but they maintain that full ankle mobility, closed cuisses, long skirt, symmetrical arms and shoulders, and the great bassinet. It's the recipe for the job. And you don't need to argue that the Habsburgs in the 16th century were copying the English. There might be a connection, because the English and the people in the Low Countries had a lot of connection all the way through, and there could be some residual awareness that this is how you build foot combat armor for a long time. But equally, this could just be someone who knows armor and knows that that's what you're going to need for fighting on foot, and it's a spontaneous generation. But interestingly, just as I had changed my armor to be more centrally weighted in its design, better for fighting on horseback, even though it still does a good job on foot, you start to see that happening on the English effigies as well. It's like they went to the extreme and then realized we've gone too far with the specialism. We need to pull it back a little bit. And so you see, very similar things to what I did, and obviously I'm doing it based on these examples, so it's a kind of a cyclical thing. Now, another important reference point in England might be that Italian armor starts to be imported into England in very large numbers in around 1435. It's possible that there was a fair amount of Italian armor in England previous to that, but it wasn't stylistically distinct enough for us to be able to recognize it in the visual sources. And that influx of Italian equipment might have something to do with changes in England. But let's just take stock again of where we are in Italy. The Italian armor. Or let's transmogrify it to use Ian Laspina's very good digital reconstruction. I helped a bit with this on it, but let's give him the credit for it. It's a really nice digital rendition that gives you an idea of what the famous Avant armor in Glasgow is supposed to look like. He did a very good video on that actually, and explains the different possible combinations of plates and things. But even this armor incidentally has to date from between 1438 and 1440. It's often dated all over the place, but it has to date within those 2 years. And there's a very good reason for that. The leg armor was made by Giovanni da Garibaldi, a named Italian armorer. But the rest of the armor is produced in the Corio workshop. Several members of the Corios, working in Milan at that time. And we know from the documents that Giovanni da Garavale only worked for the Corios as a leg armor specialist for 2 years. There's a contract. It survives in the Archivio di Stato in Milan. So that's got to be the date of the armor. And already, this is heavy stuff. I mean, we're only talking about a couple of kilos here or there, but in human terms, you all know if you've got a kilo more there or here, it makes a huge difference in human terms. So the fact that you've got nearly 18 kilos before you have legs, gauntlet, or helmet is a pretty big deal. And he's headed towards that 35 kilo cutoff that I've just arbitrarily established earlier. I think, obviously there are some armors that go above 35 kilos, but 35 kilos I think is anatomically the moment when you really start getting slowed down by your equipment. If you want to wear an armor above 35 kilos, you've got to train in it all the time. And you've got to work pretty hard to maintain physical fitness to be able to carry that weight, and you're still making life pretty hard for yourself. And really, if you want to fight on foot a lot, especially where the horse isn't doing any work for you, bringing that weight down to 25 kilos or something is a good idea. And the Italians are headed up towards the maximum weight, usually as a matter of course. Italian armors overall seem heavier, on the heavier end of the spectrum, but since they're fighting primarily on horseback as heavy cavalrymen, sure they fight on foot sometimes, but the weight is going up. I just wanted to throw this in. Of course, the other thing that really defines the Italian armors and really suggests that cavalry emphasis is the asymmetry, the asymmetrical idea that you build the left side differently than the right side. This is one of the earliest Italian depictions of an asymmetrical armor that I've been able to find. Obviously, there are probably more out there, but this is a nice early one. These little oval-shaped shoulder plates are very distinctive of 1400, 1405. They're very specific in the chronology. So that the asymmetry is extreme when you then put this big plate with the standing plate on the other side. Very early to see that, but they're already doing it. And then, of course, very rapidly, as you go into the 15th century in Italy, they start building up the left side. The right side starts to get built up too, but they're trying to have it both ways. They want maximum protection on one side, and they want maximum mobility on the other side, because fighting on horseback is fundamentally an asymmetric activity. Now, the Italians knew the dangers that they were getting into when they build something so specifically for fighting on horseback, or rather putting the emphasis that far on fighting on horseback. And I mean, you see quite clever little functional options that they allow in the equipment to try and say, okay, this is heavily weighted fighting on foot, but fighting on horseback. But what if we end up on foot? What do we do? So I think, for example, one of the main reasons you get the sleeves falling over the vambraces but under the pauldrons is to give some level of adaptability. You can take the pauldrons off, you can take the skirt off, you can take the whole bottom half of the cuirass off at an early stage, and you're still reasonably well protected. If you've just got voiders in there, you can't really take the shoulder plates off. You still got metal on you to a serviceable extent. And then, of course, you see them continue. When they're fighting on foot in lighter infantry roles, you can take the whole cuirass off, and you've got a, hey presto, you've got a mail shirt on under there. And you know, this is a fascinating, a different way of getting around the problems that when you're fighting in different ways, you need different equipment. I think this is one of the fascinating aspects of technological development that I've encountered a lot recently looking at the early history of firearms and their use on horseback by armored horsemen in the early 16th century. We often know where we want the technology to go a long time before the technology will let us get there. For example, it was perfectly perfectly obvious to Italians in the beginning of the 15th century that giving firearms to fully armored horsemen could potentially be a good idea. There could be something in that. But the firearms technology of the time wouldn't allow it. You cannot have a horse, full plate armor, and a matchlock gun that's like this big 80 caliber handgun cannon thing, and then you got to keep the match cord going all the time, and there's no mechanical way of giving fire to the weapon, so you got to do it with two hands while you're holding on to the horse. And you know, they tried, the engineers tried to find answers to this, but the technology just wouldn't let them. Similarly here, they are, as plate armor develops, they know that for a specific way of fighting, there's an optimal kind of equipment. How do you get the right equipment at the right moment for the right job at all times? It's a major problem. And you can see these issues flying around in other ways where the Italians know how they fight. And the Italians, you know, Italian armorers know what Italian knights need. And they build those armors because that's how they're fighting. But the Italian armorers were also armor merchants. They were also great businessmen. They knew there was a whole world out there that they could cater for. But the French and the English and the Iberians and the Germans and the Flemings and everybody else, they all have different ideas about how they're going to use the armor. They have different ways of fighting. And how do we cater to that in an export market? When we don't even know what they're going to do in the armor, how do we build armor that is more generically useful to everybody? And you see this style evolving very rapidly from about 1435. This is a French effigy fragment, and this is an English effigy that's in my second book coming. I should say something about that in a minute, because it's late. I went on YouTube a couple of years ago and said, I don't quite know when the next book's coming out, but regardless of when it comes out in 16, 17, or 18, I just guarantee you it won't come out as late as 2019. And it is probably coming out in 2019. When Blade Runner is set, right? So this is Italian armors that are built in a different way. The Italians know that there's all kinds of other ways people might be fighting in their armor, and we need to have an export product that has the best chance of being useful to the widest number of people possible. If we get too specific, the English aren't going to want it. If we get too specific this way, the Germans won't want it. What can we design that will be good for the most different jobs for as many people as possible? And this is what they come up with. Symmetrical, light shoulder plates, very good range of movement, symmetrical arms, little bessicues you can tie on or take off. Longer, the export Italian armors have longer skirts than the domestic Italian ones usually. Because you can ride in a longer skirt, you can get the job done, but you might really want that for fighting on foot. So, Arna can't kick you in the nuts. Right? And hey presto, you take something like the very important Italian export armor and in Vienna, made for a German nobleman in Italy by named Italian armorers. This one's 5 plates long rather than the more typical 6 plates long for export. But it's still longer than what an Italian would build for an Italian. And it's got the great bassinet. This is starting to seem like a very recognizable export pattern. It's what the Germans like, it's what the French like, it's what the English like, and the Iberians are going along with what everybody else does. I don't think there are any Spanish people around. The one thing that I think is really unusual and interesting about this particular armor is that it has symmetrical shoulders with asymmetrical arms. You don't get a sense of that because the left reinforce is missing, but this would have a bigger left reinforce and a smaller right one. And it's the only example of that as far as I know. If you get it mismatched, it's almost always asymmetrical shoulders with symmetrical arms, not the other way around. So this is unique for that reason. But otherwise, it fills this pan-European export thing. The Italians were financially hugely successful exporting armor all over the place because they knew that there was a relationship between what you design and the degree of specialization and how commercially viable that's going to be on a mass scale. Don't forget, these are people who are building thousands of armors at a time. In England, I found, for my next book, I found records of imports of 300 Italian armors being bought in a single sale. 400 Italian armors here, 500 Italian armors there. This is not an individual to individual thing at all. So there's got to be these mass-produced things that are going to just do the best job for as many people as possible. And I think there are lessons for us in all of this when we, again, define what we personally want to be doing in our kit. What historical choices can we make that will best serve what we're doing? And of course, I should say that there are in England, there are a couple of examples of the classic asymmetrical Italian armors appearing in England, but very few. I mean, you can count them on one hand and still have some fingers left, right? But there's some, and they're pretty fantastic. And for me, these are really great examples too, because I'm trying always to prove that the effigies are really prioritizing technical realism, the accuracy of the equipment that they're showing. And they care about that for very specific reasons that cut right to the heart of what these artworks are for. You know, these are meant to be simulacra of the deceased people. This sculpture takes the physical place in the world of a person who's dead and gone. What happens when someone dies? They die and then they're gone. Poof! They're not here anymore. What happened to them? Where did they go? Why can't I talk to them anymore? The effigy takes that physical place. But more importantly than that, it's also a motivator for intercessionary prayer. The prayers of the living benefit the soul's progress through purgatory and hopefully to heaven. And it appears to be a relationship between the realism, the lifelike, tangible qualities of the sculpture have an effect on the intercessionary prayer. The prayers work better if it's a good representation of the person in life. Because that person's existence is right in your head, and when you pray for them, it's a very powerful thing. So this is literally art that will save your soul, right? And the armor's got to be right. And if the armor's not right, you're spending an extra 1,000 years in purgatory. Seriously, I'm not making this up. It might be exaggerating.
500 years.
But and here I can demonstrate that. You don't have to take my word for it. With the English effigies, we have a real problem because there's no English armor surviving, so far as we know. So I have nothing to compare the effigies to. I just people need to take my word for it that this is really good. And you need to know a lot about armor to be able to see that without anything to compare it to. But with these, I have English effigies that show Italian armor, and we can compare it to real Italian armor. It looks just like it, down to the little file marks they put on the rivets. They're on the effigy as well. So these are a great way of really establishing that the effigy carvers are paying attention to what they're looking at. So you do get the classic heavy cavalry Italian armors appearing in a couple of cases, but really hardly at all. And in the brasses, we take the brasses into account as well. You see both types of Italian export armor in England from the 1430s onwards. You've got that typical export pattern, you know, the armor that's a good balance of everything and is going to do every job pretty decently. And then you've got the ones that are more classically asymmetrical Italian that are, you know, moving into the realm of heavy cavalry more specifically, but they still have the great bassinets and certain things that the English like. But I guess my point with all of this is that, you know, it's already in the 15th century getting quite specific to the job. Certain things are going to do that job just a little bit better. And it might be that only tiny fraction of functionality that is the difference between life and death. The fact that your arm can just effortlessly move upwards a little higher at that one moment. You're not fighting your Italian pauldrons when you're trying to guard your head and getting a spear through your face. Not to say you can't do it, but what is absolutely right for the job. So, pondering my predicament with my armors, and the English armor really not being ultimately right for what I have found myself doing, I built another armor. And of course that was really the genesis of my whole Italian armor project, sitting down and thinking, okay, well what is really right for what I'm doing? I've learned everything I could from the English project, but now how can I put that, that to work? And the Italian armor was where it went. And I spent quite a number of years working in the Italian armor in various states of development, and doing a number of different kinds of things in it. Of course, you can do whatever you need to do in an Italian armor, really. But still, there are times when you're trying to get something done in an armor like this, other than fight on horseback with the lance, and you're thinking, this is seeming like it's really harder than it should be. And I'm having to work really hard here, and I'm in a bit more pain than I feel I should be in, and I'm not having as much fun as I feel like I should be having. What is the answer to this? Well, you can take your visor off. Okay, fine. You can take your reinforce off. Fine. What else can you do? You start to see this happening as well. Again, more evidence of changing the armor for specific reasons. This is the Beauchamp effigy at Warwick in England is a great example of this, primarily for the helmet. Resting under his head is the armet that you would absolutely expect an armor like this to be worn in. If you look really carefully on the effigy, you stick your head under there if you can get away with it, and you can see the closing of the cheek pieces at the back of the helmet and the strap going over the back. Everybody knows here what an armet looks like, right? It's an armet. And you step back a little bit, you can see the artist's rendition of the male aventail falling down, the buckle at the side, the wrapper plate there, but it's a jousting visor, right? Or, it's a visor that looks awfully like a jousting visor, maybe because they're saying, let's optimize this absolutely for heavy cavalry use. There's a rare picture of it without the head on it.
Yeah, and it doesn't have a rondel.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it should probably have a rondel. Is there a...
You see the hole?
Yeah, there's no hole.
Right at the top.
There's a hole up there, but that might be an assembly hole for something else. Maybe the artist just thought, no, I'm not putting a rondel on, I don't know. But this is looking like, to me, it's looking like a war armor now that they are saying, but could we also make little adaptations to make it better for fighting in tournaments? Could we do that? If we just remind ourselves what the field visor looks like, it's a pretty different facial profile. And a friend of mine a couple of years ago, I mean, this is good protection for the face, don't get me wrong, but a friend of mine still did get a lance through his eye wearing a helmet like this, because it's, for lance combat, it's not as good as that, right? The angles, the distance of the sight from the eyes, and so forth. So does the Beauchamp effigy represent, again, evidence that we can swap in other pieces to change the function of the armor for different jobs? Yeah, and then I spent a number of more years doing various things in the Italian armor. But after a while, there are certain cases, of course, where having a very thick cuirass that's 14 kilos, over 14 kilos, is great. When you're going into a joust with steel spearheads on solid lances, the heavier end of the spectrum seems like a good idea. And let's put the great bassinet with the jousting visor and everything on there. But in other situations, I can't really help envying this guy, who can move his arms a hell of a lot better than I can, and is not getting tired as fast as I am. And that's because he's in better shape, but it's also because his armor weighs half of what mine does. Right, and there's envy creeping in here. This is for certain things. This armor is really seeming like I'm bringing a tank to a go-kart race, and also in my life, I've gotten to a point here in 2014. It all blends into a big mess. I'm getting to a point where I'm busier at work. I'm older. I don't have as much time to train. I've got small children, and there's a lot of things now changing what my personal situation is and my personal needs for my equipment. Of course, also, let's not forget that there are stylistic considerations here, and the degree to which different styles, different regional styles blend together and influence each other is very important and interesting as well. We mustn't discount entirely the fact that Germans like different decoration than Italians or whatever, and that the Italians have a different idea of what they think the Germans will like. This is intrinsically Italian decoration, but catering to a German taste. And here, I mean, this is an armor made in Italy for a German, but it still is a heavy Italian armor. It still works essentially as an Italian armor does, although you do have a German construction, the cuirass, but still a lot of this is very Italian. And of course, towards the end of the 15th century, there are other pressures coming into play. There's military technology, but also strategic and tactical evolution. And with the rise of concepts like the pike formations and the increasing numbers of firearms being employed by more armies in larger numbers than ever before, the total number of infantrymen, low, non-noble, non-knightly infantrymen that you have access to is a given. Do you want those guys to be fighting as men-at-arms, or do you really need them to be pikemen or musketeers? And if you're putting more people into that, what does that mean for the job description of the knights and men-at-arms themselves? Does that mean that they now have to be prepared to fight in more different ways on the battlefield, to plug different gaps in the army depending on the situation? That means that your armor is going to have to be ever more flexible and adaptable and changeable. Increasingly, this guy has to be prepared potentially to fight like these people. The handguns are really starting to come in especially. So I got very interested in this whole relationship between style and function and technology and just the total weights. I think everybody needs to think much more about the total weight that they're carrying. I think it's useful for everybody always to go away and think very carefully. Am I wearing more weight than I have to be carrying? And what are the long-term effects of that going to be? It's hard for 20-year-olds to think that way, Isaac. But, take it from me, it's worth thinking about. Because I now have long-term health issues from too many years of wearing heavy armor. Or maybe wearing armor that wasn't right for the job at the particular moment. And what do I do about it now? And what do the sources tell me I can do? My latest project now, because the 35 kilo armor is just not feasible for me anymore. Again, if I trained a lot all the time, it'd be fine, even at 40 whatever. But I don't. And I want to keep doing stuff, but I need an armor that's appropriate to where I am now. So I look at the sources. What do the sources tell me I can do? And you look at this armor at Kerberg, and the cuirass, it looks externally like a lot of other cuirasses. It's 7 kilos. The whole thing. Breastplate, backplate, tassets. Total weight, 7 kilos. That's a lot different than 14 in functional human terms of how long you're going to wear that before you start hating life. And I thought, I like Italian armor still, it's not that I don't, but I don't want to build an armor at 20 kilos that's supposed to be 35. I don't want to just make a cosmetic approximation of a 14 kilo cuirass and make it 7 kilos. I would rather build something that's really supposed to be that sort of weight. So this is my new project, basically. And also looking at this one, this is another one made also for the same person, Gaudens von Match. of Coburg Castle. Of course, everybody's familiar with it. And even within these two armors, made for the same person at the same time by the same armorer, you get differences like, yeah, I need those asymmetrical big wing pauldrons when I'm fighting this way, but let's have some of those as well. Those will be good to have for something else. You really start to see towards the middle of the 15th century that there are all these options. And why couldn't someone have 3 visors and 2 sets of pauldrons and all of these options to mix and match their armor for everything they need to do? You all as practitioners can recognize the benefit of that. And you've probably all thought of doing that yourselves. And I think that's very interesting because that's a thinking that's arising from the needs of the practice. But that's also exactly where it went historically. And it just kept going. They're not trying to stay in the 15th century. They're just going through time. So I've started to put this Coburg armor together. I first got my original helmet that we started this talk with back after like 16 years. 16 years after I sold it. Missed it every day after I sold it. Never stopped missing that helmet. This was the first helmet that Robert McPherson ever made. This was the helmet that introduced me to Robert McPherson, a long and a happy relationship. And I got the helmet back. So this helmet forms the core, kind of going full circle in a way, because I always liked Innsbruck armor, even when I was like 15. So coming back to that. But also this is a good armor to build now, because the back plate of that Gaudenz von Match armor, you saw he's missing his back plate at Coburg. That's because it's in the Royal Armories in Leeds. So Leeds is pretty close, and we're able to go look at it and build it. This is the armorer's first attempt at the back plate. And we're able to say, okay, you got it about halfway, we're going back to the museum. How many armorers get to do this? Put the work half done next to the original that they're working from. Yeah, I'm not sure. Yeah. There's not many armorers, I wonder whether they would have the courage to do it. It's a humbling experience. And ultimately this was remade from scratch because there was some crucial things about it that weren't right. Continuing obviously to build this stuff. Meanwhile, the elbows are based on original Innsbruck elbows in the Met. So I still like working with Jeff Wasson as well, but I want to maintain that armor access to the originals wherever I can. So I said, Jeff, can you just go over to the Met and look at these elbows? Those are the ones I want in your own time. Thanks very much. So there's Jeff. That's Jeff Wasson's hand there with the original Innsbruck Kauter that we're working on. And then I got various pieces from various places. The shoulders are made by Fred Ryle in Liverpool. Very, very good up-and-coming armor. The Bessigues, meanwhile, are made by Bill Radford. Does anybody know the name Bill Radford? Yeah. He made these. I said, everywhere I'm thinking about light. I want this armor to be light, but I want it also to be very specifically designed, the weight in the right places for what I'm doing. And obviously the helmet seems to me pretty substantial still. I think after the helmet, even if you have quite a light armor that's more in the range of like 20 kilos hopefully, the Bessigues should be beefy. If you don't get hit in the face, and if you don't get hit in the shield, certainly in a joust, you're going to get it in the Bessigue. And I love Bessigues because you can make them super thick and beefy, and they're a great piece of armor to have right on the front of your body. But even if they're like 2-3 millimeters thick, medium or high carbon steel as these are, Radford actually told me after making them that he made them out of an 18th century high carbon steel shovel blade. That's a great way of putting a lot of protection in a key area. And I remembered years ago, I was jousting at the Tower against Luke Binks actually, and I had at that point some Bessigues that were spring steel, but they were only like a millimeter or .2 thick or something. And his lance skated off my shield, hit me, pow, straight in the Bessigue, and turned that thing into a steel taco shell. And I thought, better it than me, right? But really, I don't want my Bessigoose to get that trashed. So I took a lesson from that. Very deep shape, but also really thick piece of armor that adds a lot of protection for not very much a weight addition at the same time. So thinking very carefully, you know, again, all you know, if you can lose 500 grams from that part, and another 250 grams can go down over there, that starts adding up real fast. And you've got lots of good fighters out there who are going to move at you fast. That stuff matters. So there's where the armor is at the moment, with the next generation, my noble heirs there. Yeah, I don't know if you, probably many of you have stood around in crowds with little children before. You notice they can't stop themselves from untying everything. I mean, you stand next to these kids for like 5 minutes and all your stuff falls off. And all the buckles, your legs are all flopping around. And little hands, you know, little fingers. This is this picture was taken earlier this year to reestablish the street credibility of my 4-year-old. Because he'd gone in at his nursery, right? And he'd been telling everybody, my dad's a knight. My dad is a knight. He's a knight. He's got armor. He fights. He's got a horse. He hits people with lances. And all the nursery school teachers were like, yes, that's fine. That's good. Yeah. He's got this weird fixation. He thinks you're a knight. Oh, yeah. So I said, I was like, okay, I'm wearing the armor into the nursery.
Yeah.
Got to do it. So when I got out of the car in that and walked in, he led me by the hand into the nursery. And it was just like, see, you rotten bastard. And it's like, you know, we forget, this is part of our lives, right? We forget there are people out there who've never seen armor, right?
Yeah.
They've never been to a museum. They have no historical awareness at all. They work in a nursery. And,
actually, those armor
their
normally are
understanding
those
of technology
which are
is
poor
cars and
afterwards.
TV, right? And this walks in. They didn't know what to think. But it was like
can that
a
be a happy
4-year-old's
life?
fantasy come badly to life. The other thing, I designed this armor, I was really thinking about self-operability. I wanted as much of this armor to be to things I could do myself. And this nursery job was interesting because I was sitting in my workshop thinking, shit, I've got to get all this on before we go. There's nobody here to help me. One way or another, I got to get this whole damn armor on myself. And I put the entire thing on myself, and it's the first time in 25 years of fighting in armor that I've ever had something I can put on completely by myself without any help at all. So that's pretty cool. I mean, it's nice to have help, obviously, but you know, with a war armor, you never know what kind of situation you're going to get into. You never know when you might need to put it on or take it off yourself, and there you go. It's and Italian armors just aren't self-operable, and they're not going to be. Also, just to relate this back to some other work I've been doing more recently, because I'm always, you know, I'm finding new levels to this every time I've given a new academic assignment at the museum or whatever. You know, some new level of this presents itself to me. I think the diversification of all these different fighting forms in the 15th century is very much appealing to the knightly mentality. And it's like it's an expansion of the chivalric culture, which ultimately, what is the job description of a knight? On a really basic level, this is a person who needs an extraordinary diversity of skills, just on a human level, not just fighting. You've got to be a leader of men. You've got to be a politician, a diplomat. You've got to know about wine and table manners and entertaining and music and dancing. And then you've got to know about fighting on foot and on horseback with all kinds of different weapons or with no weapons at all. You know, the man-at-arms, or certainly the aristocratic knight, needs in all aspects of his life to demonstrate incredible levels of diversity, of skill and awareness and training and everything else. And I think as these fighting roles are developing, and as there is more technical armor requirements, this appeals very much, and it's actually fueling the chivalric culture. And the Renaissance is becoming more medieval than medieval in a way, because the chivalric culture by that point is hugely advanced. That's what I think, you know, one of the reasons why you get all these different forms of joust This is not all of them. This is just as many as I could fit on the page here. One of the reasons this kind of diversity of joust appeals is, again, it demonstrates that diversity and adaptability of the individual. Some of these jousts are lighter and faster, and others are heavier and slower. And you know, a lot of these, maybe they don't look cosmetically that different to most people, but the human experience of you know, doing a Welschrennen versus a Deutsche Gesteck is massive. In the human terms of being there, it feels really different, even though the outward appearance it can be, you know, somewhat similar. I've written a big article on these Maximilian jousts for an edition of the Vienna Jahrbuch that's coming out, special Maximilian anniversary issue next year. And I've written a big article on what I think about these jousting forms. And a lot of it is just showing that these people can do anything in any situation. And this is not even talking about the diversity of foot combat forms. And of course, ultimately, in the 16th century, this is where they continued to go. You know, we think of the garniture, the armor that has all these interchangeable parts for adapting the same armor for all these different functions. We think of that as an intrinsically high Renaissance 16th century thing, when really this is just the end of the story. That diversification of fighting method and trying to optimize our equipment for specific roles have been going on for at least 100 years before. And all the pieces of the garniture concept have been in place for a long time. This is just the final synthesis. We're perhaps more familiar with you know, the joust, war, and tournament garnitures of the 16th century, the armors that do everything. But again, fully enclosed cuisses, long skirt, symmetrical shoulders. 200 years later, there's certain things that are right for the job. So I guess in conclusion, the sum total of what I have to say after 25 years of thinking about this is, you know, think very carefully of how much weight you're carrying, and is what you're wearing right for the job that you're doing. If you go through that process, you're probably already having a lot of fun, but you'll have more fun, and your bodies will ultimately thank you for it. Thank you.
Alright guys, that concludes the video. We thank you very much for watching, as always. Special thanks to Arne Coates for hosting the event at his place in Germany. Had a really great time. His place was awesome, and it was absolutely perfect kind of place to hold that sort of lecture. So, of course, I'd like to also thank Dr. Tobias Capwell for not only taking time for me to do an interview with him, but also allowing us to have his lecture on our channel as well.
And most importantly, let's thank our Patreon supporters who definitely help make this possible. That currently, with the intro and outro part of this, you're seeing with the newest equipment that we've got, the new camera, lighting, all that such, microphones. So hopefully from here in the future, a lot of our videos will be a little crisper, a little cleaner, a little brighter, and you know, aside from the content being as accurate as we can make it, it'll be better because of you.
Yes, so thank you. And if you guys like what we're doing and want to see us better improve the channel, that's the best possible way to do so. So we'll have the links in the description below, and be sure to check it out and share it with your friends. So thank you very much for watching, and we look forward to seeing you in the next video.